Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. The whole mess in Nigeria surrounding their SARS police force and how it's being replaced by SWAT and greater regional concerns that no one seems to be talking about. So anyway, there's a lot to cover here. So to quote Philip DeFranco, let's just jump into it. So a few weeks ago, protests broke out in Nigeria because there was a viral video that was released showing a young man basically being gunned down by someone who's suspected to be a SARS member. Now, SARS in Nigeria is the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, and that's sort of where a lot of this starts. So SARS was started in 1992 to tackle problems that were happening in Nigeria related to like carjacking, like violent arrests and intimidation, armed robbery, kidnapping, things like this. And initially they were a covert force, so they were plain clothes. They didn't have a uniform. And so of course this leads to problems where, because they don't have a uniform, some of them felt they could kind of do whatever they wanted. And so very quickly they developed a reputation for brutality, harassment, extortion, rape, torture, and even extrajudicial killings, which brings us back to the whole viral video that came out a few weeks ago from, I think it was the Delta state in Nigeria. So that's the core background of these protests. Now, these protests, ostensibly about police brutality. Lots of people in North America should be familiar with this, with all the Black Lives Matter protests happening. This is basically a similar thing in Nigeria, except the response has been alarming. So the government said on October 11th that they would disband SARS and replace it with SWAT, which is Special Weapons and Tactics. Most of us in the West are familiar with this. It's police on crack, and they're the ones who break down your door, and they're all black and everything like that. So that's what's supposed to replace SARS, which isn't really pleasing a lot of protesters because they feel it's probably going to be SARS by another name. So the hashtag #EndSARS has now been replaced with #EndSWAT. And the protesters have several demands, which I'll get to in a second. But basically, while these protests started off against police brutality, they quickly spiraled into greater kind of anti-government protests. Young people are mad about a lack of economic opportunities, corruption in the government in general, and not just in the police forces. They're bothered by crime and corruption, and this then finally brings us to the current protests' demands and how the government is responding to them. So really quick, the demands, they basically have 5 of them. They want the immediate release of all arrested protesters. They want justice for those killed by police and compensation for their families. They want an independent body to investigate and prosecute police misconduct within 10 days of a claim. They want independent psychological evaluation of disbanded SARS officers before they can be redeployed. And they also want increased salaries for police so that they are adequately compensated for protecting lives and property. Overall, these seem like really balanced and arguably progressive demands on behalf of the protesters. So how has the government responded? According to Amnesty International, at least 15 people have been killed in protests and clashes in the 2 weeks that these protests have started. 2 of the 15 have been police officers. So at least a dozen dead protesters. And I'm not sure if that includes what happened, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, whenever this goes up, where there was videos showing how after sort of the lights had went out and police and Nigerian soldiers had opened fire on protesters, you can see what looked to be dead bodies in the streets. So the response has been more police brutality and more violence, even though the demands are perfectly reasonable and understandable. So this is a broad summation of the story as it stands. And I think it's important that people know about this, not just to show solidarity with people protesting against police violence and police brutality and corruption around the world, but there's a part of this story that is being left out, and that's ultimately what's bothering me today. So while SARS was started in 1992 as like an anti-kidnapping, carjacking, and armed robbery thing, it kind of begs the question of why this was a thing. Now, yes, a lot of that has to do with poorer countries, poverty, and it's a problem. What's left out of that is the fact that a lot of the kidnappings, as people might remember with the like hundreds of Nigerian schoolgirls who were kidnapped by, it wasn't Al-Shabaab, but like Ansar al-Sharia or whatever they are in Nigeria, like basically Nigeria's version of Al-Qaeda or ISIS kidnapped hundreds of Nigerian schoolgirls a few years ago. That's been a problem for a while, where people are kidnapped and held for ransom so that insurgency groups, whether they are Muslim and they want like Sharia law and Islamic caliphates throughout West Africa, or they're independence movements like, oh, we want ours to break away because we feel that we're not being respected by the government. And this is rooted in colonialism and poor borders and all this other stuff, which honestly, I could do a whole like week-long mini-series on this, and I promise it's coming. But I want to focus on the kidnapping and funding for, let's just say, Islamic terrorist organizations in West Africa, because a lot of people don't realize this, but the war on terror, which is basically the West versus Islamic extremists, let's be real here, that has shifted from the Middle East broadly. It has shifted to Africa because there's this region along the Sahel where a lot of colonial borders crisscrossed on not only different tribes, but different religions. So from Senegal across to Sudan and Ethiopia and Somalia and stuff, basically across that sort of band at that latitude, you have a lot of nations where there tends to be a lot of Muslims in the north and Christians and traditional pagan and like traditional religious and spiritual beliefs in the south. So with this in mind, this is where a lot of problems are showing up. It's why Canada, France, Britain, America, and several others are in places like Mali. That's why the French are also involved in the Central African Republic and their ongoing civil war between Christians and Muslims. It's why Sudan ultimately had to break up into a predominantly Muslim North and the new Christian South Sudan. This is a thing that's going to plague West and Central Africa for decades to come, probably. And this is going to be a focus of the war on terror and international Western geopolitics for a while, but no one talks about that. And so again, in Nigeria, part of why they moved their capital to Abuja, which is in the north, is so that it was A, more centrally located, and B, a lot of the Nigerians in the north who are Muslim could feel like they were being listened to and respected and had a say in the governance of Nigeria, which again is Africa's most populous country. It's 110 million people crammed into an area that's about, I think, the size of Texas. So it's a nexus point for anything in Africa. Economic success or failure, a lot of people look to Nigeria. As an ally in the fight against the war on terror, Nigeria. As a good sort of hub for transit and industry and how it meets, you know, the north, south, and the east, west of Africa, it all hinges on Nigeria. It is a very important, in terms of geopolitics, an incredibly important nation, which is why so many nations, whether it's China, America, France, Britain, have all put lots of investment and paid a lot of attention to Nigeria, which then begs the question of why does the West and our news media seem to be so silent on this issue? And again, it has to do with police brutality, because if they actually fix that and report on it, then that gives an impetus and a swell of support and a morale boost to those of us in the West, which the neoliberal elite doesn't want because they like the police state. It lets them make all their money and keep us under their boots for a while. And if they pay more attention to Nigeria, and if things go poorly, that doesn't suit the broader neoliberal agenda. It doesn't suit them at all. And so I would like people to come away from this, not only learning a bit about Nigeria's history with regards to SARS and why the protests are happening, but why we aren't hearing about it and why it's actually way more important than many people realize. Nigeria is in many ways the heart and the pulse of the modern African continent. And that's why we need to respect it and pay attention to it. But the fact that we aren't is what's bothering me today.